The hearing process had taken 6 minutes. That was what offended Lord Vethon the most when he thought about it afterward, in the quiet of the aftermath when there was finally enough stillness to think about anything at all. 6 minutes. His head of household staff had interviewed the woman, checked her documentation, confirmed her references, and offered her the position of personal attendant to Princess Kael Dreshkin of the Velthari Royal House in 6 minutes, which was 3 minutes shorter than the standard hearing process for a kitchen assistant and 11 minutes shorter than the standard process for any position involving direct access to a member of the royal family. The head of household staff, a meticulous being named Orath who had been managing the royal house's domestic operations for 22 years, and who had never made a significant staffing error in those 22 years, had explained the 6 minutes afterward. He had said she had every qualification. Her documentation was flawless. Her references were from 3 separate households of equivalent standing. Her manner was correct. Her presentation was appropriate. There was nothing in the 6 minutes that suggested anything other than what she appeared to be. Lord Vethon had not blamed Orath. He had thought about blaming Orath for approximately 30 seconds before deciding that blame was the wrong frame for what had happened, and that the right frame was something he did not yet have a word for, something that existed in the space between extraordinary competence and the specific kind of invisibility that extraordinary competence could produce when it chose to look ordinary. The woman's name on her documentation was Mara, no family designation. Human workers in Velthari service frequently presented without family designations because the Velthari naming conventions did not map cleanly onto human naming structures, and most human workers in formal Velthari positions adopted the simplified format. Mara, single name, age listed as 31. Originally from Earth's third outer settlement, a mid-tier colony that produced a steady supply of qualified domestic workers for the Velthari noble houses that had begun employing humans in the decade following Earth's conclave membership. She had presented herself at the household staff office on a Tuesday morning with her documentation folder and her 3 references, and a manner that Orath had described as quietly competent, which was exactly the manner that personal attendants to royal family members were required to have, because proximity to royalty required a specific quality of invisibility, the ability to be present without being noticed, to anticipate without being asked, to manage without creating the impression that management was occurring. Mara had that quality. She had it in a way that Orath, 22 years into the job, had found immediately recognizable and had taken 6 minutes to confirm was genuine rather than performed. He had not been wrong that it was genuine. He had been wrong about what it was genuine evidence of. Princess Kael Dreshkin was 14 years old and was the 3rd child of Emperor Vail Dreshkin, which placed her 4th in the line of succession, and in the specific position of being important enough to require significant security and unimportant enough that the significant security had over the years become somewhat less significant than protocol required. Because the genuine threats to the royal house concentrated on the 1st and 2nd in line, and the resources concentrated accordingly, and the 3rd child in 4th position had a security detail that was adequate on paper and slightly less than adequate in practice. The head of the princess's security detail was a senior officer named Dreven Thal, who was competent and experienced, and who had been managing the princess's security for 3 years with the professional efficiency of someone who had assessed the threat environment and allocated his resources accordingly, and had not, in 3 years, encountered a situation that had required him to revise that assessment. He had not met Mara on the day she was hired. He had received the standard notification that a new household staff member had been cleared and assigned to the princess's personal staff, had reviewed the documentation, had noted no flags, and had returned to his operational planning for the princess's upcoming public appearance schedule. He met Mara on her 3rd day, when he conducted his standard check-in with all new household staff assigned to direct royal access. The check-in took 12 minutes. Afterward, he had noted in his staff review file that the new attendant was appropriately deferential, understood the security protocols she had been briefed on, and presented no concerns. He had been right that she presented no concerns. He had been wrong about why. The royal house's primary residence was a complex on the planet Vethara Prime that had been the seat of Velthari imperial power for 200 years. It was large in the way that things were large when they had been built by an imperial house that wanted its primary residence to communicate imperial power, which was to say it was enormous and filled with the specific combination of grandeur and functionality that made it simultaneously the most impressive building most visitors had ever entered, and a genuinely difficult place to manage in operational terms. Mara had the measure of it within a week. Not in the way that a new household staff member learned the layout through orientation and daily routine. In the way that someone who had been trained to understand spaces understood it, the load-bearing relationships, the structural geometry, the way the sight lines worked, and where they didn't, the acoustic properties of the main corridors and the dead zones where sound did not carry, the timing patterns of the security rotations, and the places where the rotations created gaps, and how long the gaps lasted. She had done this invisibly, in the margins of the work that was her official reason for being there, learning the space the way her work required her to be in the space, and learning the other thing at the same time, without the two things being distinguishable from the outside. Princess Kale was 14, and had the specific quality of a 14-year-old, who was smart enough to be bored by her official educational program, and not yet old enough to have found the thing that would make the boredom productive. She was sharp and restless, and had the habit of testing the people around her with questions designed to find the ones who would engage honestly rather than deferentially, because deference was what everyone gave her and honesty was what she actually wanted. She had tested Mara on the second day. She had asked during the morning routine, a question that was designed to be unanswerable without either lying or saying something that a careful attendant would not say to a royal family member. It was the kind of question that experienced household staff deflected smoothly without appearing to deflect. Mara had answered it directly. Not rudely, not without the appropriate form, but directly with the honest engagement that the princess had been looking for and had learned not to expect. The princess had looked at her for a moment. Then she had asked another question. Mara had answered that one too. By the end of the first week, the princess had developed the habit of talking to Mara during the morning routine in a way that she did not talk to any other member of her household staff. A genuine conversation, rather than the performance of conversation that royal family members learned to conduct with the people who served them. Mara had the quality that made genuine conversation possible, the quality of someone who listened with complete attention and responded to what was actually said, rather than to what the form of the situation suggested should be said. Lord Vethon had noticed. He had noted it in his weekly household review as something to monitor, not a concern, something to monitor. He had not revised his assessment before the night of the 14th day. The threat had been developing for 6 months before the night of the 14th day. The Conclave's intelligence division had a file on it. The Imperial security apparatus had a file on it. The files described a faction within the Velthari political structure that had been building capability toward an action that the files assessed as most likely targeting a member of the royal house, most likely targeting the heir or the second in line, most likely in the next 3 to 8 months. Most likely, most likely, most likely. The faction had assessed the same security concentration pattern that the resources reflected and had drawn the same conclusion about where the gaps were. They had moved on a Tuesday night. Not toward the heir, not toward the second in line. Toward the princess. Not because the princess was the highest value target, because she was the most accessible. Because the faction's operational planning had identified the specific gap in her security rotation and the specific window within that gap, and had moved assets into position over 6 months in a way that the security apparatus's monitoring had not resolved as a pattern until the assets were already inside the residence complex. Thal received the first alert at 2:17. The alert came from a sensor in the East Wing corridor, 200 meters from the princess's residential suite, flagging motion in a zone that should have been empty at this time. His response was immediate and professional and correctly executed, and was, in the assessment he wrote afterward, exactly what the protocol required. It was also 12 seconds slower than what was needed. Not 12 seconds slower than the protocol. 12 seconds slower than the faction's timeline, which had been built with the protocol's response speed in mind, and had a 12-second buffer built into it, specifically because the operational planners had studied the response protocols and had found the 12 seconds. At 2:17 and 12 seconds, 3 members of the faction entered the princess's suite through the secondary access point that the response team was not yet covering, because the response team was covering the primary access point, where the protocol said threats came from. The princess was asleep. Mara was not. What happened in the next 90 seconds was something that Thal reconstructed from the suite's internal monitoring feed afterward, in his office, watching the recording 3 times before he submitted his incident report, and writing the report in the careful language of someone who was trying to describe accurately something that his professional framework did not have adequate language for. The monitoring feed showed the 3 faction members entering through the secondary access. It showed them moving toward the princess's sleeping area with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed the approach. It showed them covering the distance to the sleeping area in the time that their operational planning had allocated for it. It showed Mara already between them and the princess when they arrived. Not positioned there in response to their entry. Already there. Already in the specific location, in the specific stance, with the specific quality of someone who had not been woken by the entry because she had not been asleep, who had been waiting in the dark with the patience of someone who had assessed the suite's geometry and the response protocol's gaps and the 12-second buffer, and had done the math, and had been in position before the faction's assets crossed the threshold. What followed was not a fight in any sense that Thal's professional training described as a fight. It was 90 seconds. The monitoring feed showed what happened in those 90 seconds. Thal watched it 3 times. He had been in the Velthari security services for 19 years. He had trained with the best close protection specialists the Imperial security apparatus produced. He had extensive knowledge of every formal martial tradition that the Velthari military incorporated into its training curriculum. He did not have a category for what he watched. The 3 faction members were not untrained. The operational planners had not sent untrained assets into the princess's suite. They were experienced, capable, selected for this specific action, because they were the people the faction trusted with an action this significant. 90 seconds. Not 90 seconds of a struggle where the outcome was uncertain. 90 seconds of something that the monitoring feed showed as the application of a specific and complete understanding of how 3 people would move, and where they would be, and what they would do next, applied with a precision that meant the outcome had been determined before the first contact, that the 90 seconds were not the contest, but the execution of something that had already been decided. The princess was awake before the 90 seconds finished. She was sitting up in her bed watching Mara, with an expression that the monitoring feed captured clearly enough that Thal could read it in the recording, and the expression was not the expression of a 14-year-old who was terrified, though she had every reason to be terrified, and it was not the expression of someone who did not understand what she was watching. It was the expression of someone who was watching something they had suspected was there, and were now seeing for the first time. The 3 faction members were on the floor, breathing, unharmed in the way that the arena's athletic achievement assessment officers had tried to describe. The way that spoke to complete control of outcome, rather than the limitation of capability. Mara turned to the princess. She said, "Your Highness, please stay in the bed until the security team arrives. They will be here in approximately 40 seconds. The princess looked at her. She said, "You knew they were coming." Mara looked at her steadily. "Yes." "Before tonight?" "Yes." The princess looked at the three people on the floor, looked back at Mara. "How long have you been here?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," she said. The security team arrived in 38 seconds. Thal was with them. He entered the suite with the controlled urgency of a security professional responding to an active threat, and found the active threat already resolved. The princess sitting in her bed, with the composure of a 14-year-old who had decided that composure was what the moment required, and Mara standing in the center of the suite with the quality she had presented in the 6-minute hearing interview. The quality that Oreth had called quietly competent, and that Thal was now looking at with the full attention of someone revising every assumption he had made in 12 minutes of check-in notes. He looked at the three faction members on the floor. He looked at Mara. He said, "Identify yourself, your actual identity." Mara looked at him with the expression that Earth's representatives had in moments like this, not the expression Thal had seen before, the expression that Vethkai had spent 18 months nomming, recognition, the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and the moment had arrived. She said, "My name is Mara Voss. I am a senior field officer of Earth's Foreign Affairs Division Protective Services." Thal looked at her. "You are not household staff," he said. "My documentation was accurate," she said. "My qualifications are real. My references are genuine. I have worked in household staff positions in 4 separate high-value residential environments." She paused. "I am also a senior field officer of Earth's Protective Services. Both things are true." Thal looked at the princess, at the three faction members, at the suite's secondary access point that his protocol had not covered. He said, "Earth's Protective Services were operating inside the Imperial residence." "Earth's Protective Services were protecting the princess," Mara said, "who is alive and unharmed, as were the 3 individuals who entered this suite, who are breathing and will have no lasting injuries." She paused. "The faction that sent them has 6 additional assets inside the residence complex, 2 in the East Corridor, 2 in the service level below this suite, 2 outside the primary access. Your response team should address those positions before they are able to regroup." Thal looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he was on his communication system directing his team to the 6 positions she had named, because the 3 seconds had been enough for him to process the fact that she had known about the 12-second buffer and the secondary access and the 6 additional assets, and she was telling him now, which meant the information was accurate, and the 3 seconds were the cost of accepting that the situation had been different from what he thought it was for the entire 14 days. The 6 positions were exactly where she had said they were. 47 minutes later, with the residence secured, and the faction's assets in custody, and the princess drinking something warm in the company of her father, the emperor, who had arrived with a speed that suggested he had not been asleep, and had possibly been receiving updates, Thal found Mara in the corridor outside the suite. She was standing with her documentation folder in her hand, which was the most incongruous detail of the entire evening. A woman who had just resolved a threat to the imperial family's 3rd child, standing in the corridor holding the folder she had brought to her hearing interview 14 days ago. He looked at her for a long moment. "Earth's Protective Services," he said. "The imperial security apparatus was not informed." "No," she said. "You were operating inside our security architecture without our knowledge." "We were operating to protect the princess," she said. "Your security architecture had a gap. The faction found the gap. We filled it. She paused. We could not fill it by informing your architecture because the gap included your architecture's information security. The faction had access to your operational planning. We assessed that closing the gap required operating outside the information environment that was compromised. Thal looked at her. You assessed that, he said. Earth assessed that, she said. I was the implementation of the assessment. He looked at the documentation folder in her hand. The references, he said, the 3 household positions. Real, she said. I have worked those positions. The skills are genuine. Household management in high-value residential environments requires a specific understanding of how those environments function that is not replicable by pretending to have it. She paused. The work is the training. The training produces the work. They are not separate. Thal thought about 6 minutes, about Oreth's assessment, about quietly competent. He thought about 14 days of a senior field officer of Earth's protective services moving through the imperial residence as a household attendant, learning the geometry and the sight lines and the rotation gaps, being present in the morning routine and the educational sessions, and the daily life of a 14-year-old princess, building the genuine relationship that had produced real conversation, all of it simultaneously and none of it distinguishable from the outside. He thought about 90 seconds. He thought about the arena's athletic achievement assessment and the evaluation that said Earth demonstrated what a civilization becomes when what it can do, and what it must do have been the same thing for long enough that the distinction disappears. He thought that he was looking at the distinction having disappeared. The Emperor will want to speak with you, he said. I know, she said. I am available. He will want to understand how Earth knew. We will explain what we can, she said. Some of it we will not be able to explain in detail, because explaining it in detail would compromise the methodology for future applications. We will explain the result and the reasoning and the outcome, and we will leave the methodology appropriately general. Thal looked at her one more time. He said, Why? Why did Earth do this? The princess is not Earth's concern. The imperial family's security is not Earth's responsibility. Mara looked at him with the expression that he was going to spend a long time thinking about. She said she is 14 years old. She was going to be killed in her bed by people who had found the gap in the architecture that was supposed to protect her. She paused. Earth fills gaps. That is what we do. The gap does not have to be our specific responsibility for us to fill it. It just has to be there and we have to be able to fill it. She paused again. We were able to fill it. Thal looked at the corridor, at the suite where the princess was with her father, at the documentation folder in the hand of a woman who was a household attendant and a senior field officer, and apparently also the thing that stood between a 14-year-old and the people who had found the 12-second gap. He thought about 6 minutes. He thought that 6 minutes had been enough time for Oreth to confirm that Mara had every qualification for the position. He thought Oreth had been entirely correct. He had just not known how many positions there were. Inside the suite, the Emperor sat beside his daughter and held her hand and looked at her with the expression of a father who had arrived in time to find that arriving in time was not something he had done, that the arriving in time had been done before he arrived. The princess looked at her father. She said she knew they were coming. The Emperor looked at the door, at the corridor beyond it. Yes. She was already there, the princess said, in the dark, waiting, before they came through the door. Yes, the Emperor said. The princess was quiet for a moment. I talked to her every morning, she said. She answered my questions, the real ones. She paused. She was protecting me the whole time. The Emperor looked at his daughter, at the 14-year-old who had woken in the night to find the threat already resolved and was now sitting with it, with what it meant, with the specific weight of understanding that someone had been there, had been present and watchful and ready, without being asked, and without being thanked, and without it ever being visible. Yes, he said quietly, she was. The princess looked at the door again. She said, I would like to thank her. The emperor stood. He thought about the 6-minute hearing process, about the documentation folder, about 90 seconds on a monitoring feed that his head of security had watched 3 times. He thought about what Earth was, about what it kept being in the gaps, in the places where the formal architecture had not reached, in the 12-second buffers and the secondary access points, and the morning routines of 14-year-old princesses who wanted honest answers to real questions. He thought that he had spent 40 minutes in an open conclave forum, calling Earth a charity case that had no foundation. He thought about the recording of that forum that was in the conclave's permanent record. He thought that the permanent record was going to be very interesting to read alongside the incident report from tonight. He opened the suite door. He walked into the corridor. He found Mara standing with her documentation folder, and he stood in front of her and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter would like to thank you." Mara looked at him. She said, "The gap is still in your security architecture. The faction's operational planners identified it. They will have shared it. It needs to be addressed before it is used again." The emperor looked at her. He said, "I know, I will address it." He paused. "My daughter would like to thank you." Mara looked at the suite door. Something moved across her expression. Brief, specific, the expression of someone who had been doing the work and for whom the work was its own completion and who was not expecting the other thing, the human thing, the thing that came after. She said, "I would like that." She followed the emperor into the suite. The princess looked at her from the bed. She said, "You answered my questions." Mara looked at her. "Yes." "The real ones," the princess said, "not the form of them." "Yes," Mara said. The princess was quiet for a moment. "Were you protecting me then too?" she said, "during the mornings when we talked?" Mara thought about that. "The talking was real," she said. "The protection was real. They were not separate things." She paused. "I told you the truth when you asked for it. That was part of the job, knowing that someone would tell you the truth is part of being safe." She paused again. "You asked good questions. You deserved honest answers. Those 2 things were both true." The princess looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you." Mara looked at the 14-year-old princess of the Velthari royal house, sitting in her bed at 3 in the morning, with the composure of someone who had decided that composure was right, and the honesty of someone who had learned that honesty was available. She said, "You're welcome." She meant both things. She had always meant both things. That was the job. That had always been the job.